Everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Megan Billingsley, and I'll be your moderator today. Anybody watching this webinar has no doubt heard students ask this question: when will I ever need to know this in the real world? This isn't just a smart aleck remark. As you'll see in this webinar, it's crucial for educators to take a step back and consider the implications of this question and how we help students answer it. We hear a lot of talk about reinventing education and preparing students for the future rather than the past. But this webinar shows you practical ways to do so. It all starts with doing more to connect classroom learning with the real world. You'll see how this approach can help overcome some of the biggest challenges in education. It can improve academic achievement, support equity, modernize the classroom, and more. Before we dive into the conversation, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, we're eager to hear your questions, so submit them anytime using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. We'll try to answer your questions during the webinar, but if time runs out, we will answer them later via email. Also, the application widgets at the bottom of your screen are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to optimize your desktop space. The slides will advance automatically. To enlarge them, click the Enlarge Slides button in the top right-hand corner of your presentation window. Finally, we are recording this webinar, so you'll be able to access the recording on demand using the link from today's event. All right, now let's meet our panelists. First, we have Dr. Joseph Goins, founder and CEO of Pathway to Careers. Dr. Goins began his career as a vocational educator in Tennessee. He worked with the Tennessee Board of Regents to develop a foundational skills program for learners, occupational profiles for the work-ready credential for technical and community colleges, and a statewide primary skills and mathematics curriculum focused on career pathways. He started Pathway to Careers because he saw the need for a change model in education. This action-based research company works closely with policy leaders, schools, and companies to apply best practices and research. Next, we have Felicia Gonzalez, who has extensive experience at the school, district, and state level. She has served as a high school principal, associate superintendent in the Clark County, Nevada School District, and deputy superintendent at the Nevada Department of Education. She now serves as an educational consultant and as vice president at the Leadership Institute of Nevada. Our third panelist is Dr. Donald Martin. He has served as a teacher, a principal, and a superintendent. He now leads Intermediate Unit 1 in Pennsylvania. Intermediate units support Pennsylvania school districts with curricula, staff development, and instructional improvement. As Executive Director of Intermediate Unit 1, Dr. Martin serves as a key liaison between school districts and both federal and state entities. So welcome to all three of you. We're excited to have you here. If you're watching this webinar, you don't need me to tell you about the problems facing K-12 education. We have plunging math and reading scores, a growing gap in academic achievement, chronic absenteeism, teacher burnout, a mental health crisis, and on and on. But I do want to ask our panelists about these issues in the context of the rather provocative title on this slide, What We're Doing Isn't Working. All three of you are educators, and you work with other educators every day. So I know you have enormous respect for what K-12 leaders do, but it sounds like you believe leaders need to take a step back and rethink some things. So Dr. Goins, let's start with you. What do you see when you talk to K-12 leaders around the country?
Thank you, Megan, for the question. And I'll begin by saying I'm joined by two incredibly effective leaders in Felicia and Dr. Barton. So thank you. I've had the privilege of being in their environments firsthand. And I'll say this, that we know from looking at the challenges and what isn't working that research bears this out, that nothing really effective happens without clear, effective leadership in a school. And so I think part of that begins with those small changes. We always think it's a big change, but it's how are we looking at our schools in an effective way? How do we create a vision? How do we communicate effectively? I think in education, a lot of teachers in particular, they see movements and initiatives as fads, and they're going to go away. If all I have to do is wait around for a little bit, this fad will go. And I think what effective leadership does is it creates the vision and the direction for change that is actually needed. And how do we sustain that change over the long haul? And that would be one of the things that I think is probably the biggest and most effective thing leaders can do.
Thank you, Dr. Goines. Ms. Gonzalez, you've worked at the school, district, and state level. When you talk to school teachers, what do you try to get them to rethink?
Well, let me just start by adding on to what Dr. Goins said, that there is definitely a need for a clear vision coming down from every level down into the classroom. And to add on to that, what is that clear path to achieving that vision? I say this because districts and schools and all the way down into the classroom, the teachers are under a lot of pressure to improve test scores, and we all know this. And so, one of the things that happens is that decisions are being made, are being made, and most of the time, the perception is that they're being made in isolation. These visions, these paths forward, they're all being done in isolation. And so, if that's the perception, how do you achieve that buy-in from the building administrators and the teachers that are in the classroom? You need that buy-in, and you also need that buy-in from your students, your parents, and your community to move things forward. So if anything is to be rethought here, is that, educators are facing many issues in the classroom, like you said, everywhere from mental health to chronic absenteeism, but we're not taking anything off of our educators' plates in order to achieve this vision. So that's something I think that everybody would love to see, is taking a step back, looking and assessing at what is actually happening in the classroom, because things have got to be removed to carve out the time to actually do the instruction and to energize the profession, and to actually excite students to want to learn in the classroom.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. Dr. Martin, in your view, what do K-12 leaders need to rethink?
Well, I agree with my colleagues on this, but I also believe that there's a sense of urgency. And when we talk about test scores, and we look at quick fixes, and as we get deeper down this path, where we see with the mental health crisis, with the number of special education students that we have, and the growing number of issues that we have in public education and education in general, I think we're oftentimes find ourselves looking for quick fixes. And that's not the answer. Dr. Goins said a few moments ago that it's those small wins, it's those small accomplishments that we need to take a look at to build upon. Yet we live in a world of trying to find that through that sense of urgency, we're trying to find that quick fix. My message is very clear to folks often, and it's being deliberate. It's looking for those small increments of change. And it's not necessarily looking at test scores as the sole purpose or the sole reason why education exists. I think any teacher will tell you that when you go look at some of those scores, that's not the student. That's not a clear reflection of our student. I'm happy to say that we have taken a look at various types of assessments, various types of ways that we can assess our students, and we can help them move along, because at the end of the day, we want them to become productive citizens. It's not based upon a math or a reading score necessarily, although that's important. It's the achievement that is important, and it's the growth that's important. And I really believe that we have this tug of war where it's a sense of urgency, yet we're telling folks to be deliberate. And I think we need to take those small wins as they come.
Excellent. Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Martin. So before we get into practical recommendations for K-12 leaders, I want to look at math as a specific example of this idea of what we're doing isn't working. Dr. Goins, up on the slide, you'll see a key finding from a survey that Youth Truth conducted last year. They surveyed 90,000 students around the country, and they found that high school students don't see value in school math. The students say the math they learn in the classroom is disconnected from their practical needs. What do you make of that?
Well, I think you're right. And I think this is an example of what we're doing that isn't working. We know this. Students have been asking the question for a long time. When am I going to use this? When am I going to use this in the real world? Why do I have to take this? And I often say, kind of jokingly, it's year 2024. We kind of owe these students an answer to this. They've been struggling with math for so long that I really think we've got to go back and revisit something like math and think about it completely different. We think about math through the lens of how do we write a better math problem versus how do we improve student engagement? How do we make engagement relevant and give the students a really good answer to that question? And by connecting it in these authentic ways, I think we can change the conversation of math. And that's something that I think we really need to do. I mean, test scores, and Don just talked about this, that test scores are not the only measure, but it is a measure, unfortunately, that we have to march to. Educators are measured based upon this. It makes the newspapers. And we haven't really seen a substantial improvement in test scores in decades. And I think what we're trying to do is think about math completely different.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so let's dig into some practical examples of what it looks like to rethink our approach to education. Ms. Gonzalez, let's start with you this time. In your experience, what holds back schools from really innovating in how they teach and how students learn?
Thank you so much for that question. I'm actually excited to answer this, but it kind of goes back to just my previous conversation is that school leaders are faced with a number of issues, and those issues seem to be piling on their plates. And so those issues trickle down into the classroom. Everyone is under a lot of pressure, pressure from the districts, from the state, and from our political leaders to improve their outcomes. And what this means in practice for administrators and for teachers is that more and more directives are being put in place. And so once again is this creates a lack of time for the teachers in the classroom. It creates a lack of time for administrators to support the creativity and the innovation that should be happening in the classroom. And then with those directives, lots of times, the approaches become one size fits all in order to achieve those better test scores. And I think all of us educators here understand that a one size fits all approach does not happen, and it is not effective. It's not effective from school to school, and it's definitely not effective from classroom to classroom. And in order to really innovate and create an environment where students really want to learn, we can't stifle that. We can't stifle our educators. Yes, we understand that there is a need that to support everything centrally, but bottom line is that one size fits all approach will never work. As a matter of fact, it hasn't been proven to work anywhere. And so we really need to look at that.
Great points. Thank you so much. And Ms. Gonzalez, can you give an example from your experience of an innovative approach that wouldn't happen in a restrictive top-down system?
Absolutely. So in my experience, when I was a principal at a career and technical academy high school. We had a diesel mechanics program, and we had groups of students that did not want to take physics, and they felt like they weren't prepared to learn Algebra 2, and they didn't see the value in learning Algebra 2. And so what we did is during our PLC time and during our planning time, we carved out time for our diesel mechanics teacher to sit down with the physics and the Algebra 2 teacher to do cross-curricular planning. And it was a game changer. the diesel mechanics teacher opened up his curriculum and said, "This is what I'm teaching," and our physics and our algebra 2 teachers took a look and said, "You know what? These are things that I can connect to what I'm doing in the classroom." And what that did is it made those connections, and the students, well, I have to say that they moved together in a cohort. We were lucky to be able to schedule it that way. So they moved as groups. So most of them were all in the same physics class. They were all in the same algebra 2 class. And so the teachers were able to customize how they were approaching their teaching and learning in the classroom, and the students actually saw the connections. And when they would go back to the diesel mechanics classroom, they saw what they were learning come to life. And so I know it can happen because I saw it happen.
And Megan, I'll add this. I can attest to this. I got a chance to visit Felicia's school when this was going on. And when you see student engagement and when you see that connection in real time, and I've told this story a lot with Felicia, that there were classrooms I visited in her school to where I did not know what the core content was because there was so much interdisciplinary work. The math was being connected to the careers. And there were times to where I literally would lean over and ask Felicia, like, what am I supposed to be looking at first? Because I was seeing so much engagement. And my favorite example of that was a STEM classroom to where I went into Felicia's classroom and the students, their final project was to build a electric guitar. And every one of those students were showing me the math, the precision, and the development of that guitar, and I was blown away. And one of my favorite quotes of all time is by John Dewey, and he said, "To find what one is fitted to do and to secure that opportunity to do that is the key to happiness." And I think what we're trying to do with some of these innovative models is how do we help students find what they're fitted to do? And then the second part of that quote, which is so important, we have to help them secure the opportunity to do it. And when you see it up close and you see engagement like that, I remember talking to students in that school. I don't remember, Felicia, but you probably had a 98%, 99% graduation rate. And they were just 100. They were so excited about their future. And when you see it up close, you're like, I think this is what it can look like. So it was a great example.
It's very well said. Thank you both so much. Dr. Martin, what's an example of innovative education from your experience?
Well, in the education world, we always use the phrase that it takes a village. We talk about school community, and I'm happy, really excited with our state of education in Pennsylvania, because when you look at that school community, we've really come together with legislators, with government, all the way drilled into the classroom, into the teachers and the students. And I'll give you an example of that. A very monumental shift in terms of policy. At one time in Pennsylvania, schools were required to have 180 days of instruction and an allotment of hours at the high school level, at the middle school level, at the elementary level, at the pre-K level. Now, a simple change of one word in policy has become an entire game changer for all of us. They changed the "and" to "or." So now you have to have the required hours or the 180 days, which provides so much flexibility for us that we're not held to that standard of the amount of hours or the number of school days, where we can now be very, very creative in public education, where we can have days where students will be doing internships and days where students will be working outside of the school system and receiving credit back to that school. We can have days of professional development for teachers where students may not be on site. School is becoming very, very non-traditional. We're working with some districts in IU1 in southwestern Pennsylvania right now. It's exciting, where superintendents are talking about having students come to school later in the day and running a couple different shifts of students. We all know, Felicia had mentioned before, students learn differently. And so, you have those early morning risers. You have those ones that are, who like to get a start later in the day, who really get energized in the late afternoon or evening. That one policy change really was a game changer for all of us, and we're really excited. We put together committees here at IU1 where we're able to work with our district leaders as well as teachers in coming up with creative ideas on how folks can capitalize on that one simple term or word in a policy change. So when you talk about innovation and one of those ideas, that's an excellent example of a school community, the true definition of a school community, because oftentimes when we look at legislators that create those policies that we have to follow, sometimes you may have educators that question that. I think in this case, this was a group effort, and everyone is excited in moving forward and seeing the changes we can make.
These examples are all so exciting to hear about. Thank you for sharing. Dr. Goins, you started Pathway to Careers to bring a research-based approach to educational innovation. So what does the research say about the kind of career-connected learning you and Ms. Gonzalez talked about?
Yeah, and I tell you what, I think research really bears this out. We looked at research on engagement and what happens when a student has purpose. And the research on this is students retain more, they perform better, they persist. And so all of these values we're looking for from educators really comes out in the research. The goal, though, is what does it look like to give a student purpose, right? How do I give a student purpose in academic learning? Topics like math that we really haven't fundamentally changed in 20, 30 years. And so our goal was to take what research says, like give a student purpose. They're going to get engaged. From engagement, performance, and all of these other values we think of very highly will kind of fall through and pull through. So I think from that perspective, we were really just trying to follow research. And by the way, CTE is a great example of research. CTE outperforms academic measures across the board. And some of these are things, and I say this a lot, best practices are best practices. Doesn't matter where it comes from. How do we pull the best practice all the way across our educational systems? So when I looked at research, I think nationwide, and Felicia, you might be able to tell me in Nevada, but 96% of kids graduate when they're in a CTE program. And I always say if we don't overthink, then they probably have purpose. They chose a pathway that gives them a lot of purpose. And one of my favorite kind of hidden research things that comes out of CTE, Career Tech Ed, is the students that graduate college. Right now, nationwide, we're averaging about a 56% graduation rate in higher ed. And that's nationwide. And if you pause and you think about all the energy we pour into getting kids to graduate college, we do about 56%. CTE, which is Career Tech, they average about 80% college completion rate. And I always chuckle at that. And I'm like, here's a group to where we probably don't even spend a lot of energy talking about college. They're in a pathway. But when they choose to go to college, they perform almost 30% higher. And I think it's just the best practice. Research says give that student an opportunity, connect them in an authentic way, and good things will happen. And that's really what we want to do. In every tool we've thought about designing, that's how we think about it.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Goins, I know the concept of building social capital in students is important to you. So what do you mean by social capital, and why should educators make it a priority?
Yeah, and this is something that follows up on the research. When you think about social capital, cultural capital is more or less what we're born with. And I always think about marginalized learners, right? And social capital goes down the path of how do we create networks of opportunity for students? How do we open more doors? I once had a superintendent come up to me after a presentation, and this person apologized. And I said, why are you apologizing? He said, I always thought my job was just to get a kid to graduate high school. He said, what you showed me was I have to help them be prepared for more, and I have to create more opportunities within the environment while I have them. And that's what social capital is about. It's how do we connect students to opportunities and networks? And one way to think about that is wealthy, high SES students. They come with a lot of cultural capital, a lot of social networking. And you think about students that are coming from a low SES background, we just don't have a lot of opportunities for these students. And if we don't create more opportunities in the environment, then I think at some level we do them a disservice. Like, how do we show them these doors, help them open the doors and see opportunities to be successful? And that's what we've tried to do with Pathway to Careers. I mean, an easy example is in academic learning, show them the relevancy in math by connecting them to a variety of careers. And, one of the things we've done so far is put 650 careers inside our math. So every time they take a math lesson, how are we trying to open that door, crack that opportunity to say, Don, you might not be aware of this, but here's a career that you can pursue. And so when I think about social capital, I think about it through the lens of equity and how do we create equity of opportunity for students. And I think we can do this in these small ways. We talked at the beginning of this. These aren't major things. It's every chance we get, can we create that breadcrumb for that student to follow? And I get excited when I see the outcomes of what we can do with it.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Goins. Dr. Martin, have you seen career-connected learning make an impact in Pennsylvania?
Certainly have. And again, we're so excited about the work that our career tech centers are doing, not only in southwestern Pennsylvania, but throughout the entire Commonwealth. We're seeing such improvements in terms of attendance and in terms of programs that are offered. And when I go with 5 CTCs, as we call them here at IU1, when I go and visit those CTCs, I'm just so impressed at the quality of programming and the equipment. And, I just watched, I was visiting one a few weeks ago or perhaps a month ago, where there was a simulation of a person who was on a heavy machinery, where the students were telling me they actually can do this from an office or from that site where the machine actually operates itself. It's just incredible. When we building upon what Joseph had mentioned about Pathways to Careers, I mean, that's one of the reasons that IU1 was really, really invested in this program. We're using that with students with mental health and special education needs, because we mentioned test scores before, and those are understandably important to educators. And for a lot of reasons, they're really important. But when we talk about, let's think about this for a minute. Our jobs are to create lifelong learners, productive citizens. How many times do we, after a student graduates, do we go out and reflect, or do we go out and we find out how that student has been successful, or perhaps what the shortfalls were for us for those students? I think that's really important. That's why we've invested a lot of time and some dollars into postgraduate surveys. They're not the easiest things to do, but they're going to be the telltale of what the work that we've done. It's going to really show us to either validate what we've done, and in many cases for us to go back to the drawing board and say, hey, we may have not hit the mark here. We need to get it right. We're utilizing, give you an example, we're utilizing Pathways to Careers in our Career Mobile Lab that goes out and visits school districts with middle school students, so we can expose them to careers at such a younger age. We're using in our digital fabrication labs. We're using it with students with mental health diagnosis and special education needs. So there's such a diverse population. And again, at the end of the day, it's really finding that niche for that student. That, all students are created differently. We understand that. There are students that may have some disabilities, but by no means does that mean that those students aren't intelligent, aren't creative, aren't talented, and aren't very special. And so to be able to put this all together and to be able to utilize these resources like Pathways to Careers, as well as other vetted programs, it's really exciting to see what career education, the direction and the trajectory that we've seen with career education, moving beyond just a 4-year college degree or an associate's degree, but exposing students to a wide variety of opportunities.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Ms. Gonzalez, how do you see career-connected learning working in a traditional educational environment?
This is a very great question. And this is a question that I think a lot of comprehensive high school principals are probably asking. It can happen in a high school. I've seen it happen as I moved into supervisory positions. I was able to support high schools who did take this type of approach. And what they did was they ensured that every student had some connection to some type of pathway, whether it's a fine arts pathway, a career technical education pathway. If it was ROTC, there was some type of pathway, some type of connection that the student had to their learning. And it is possible to do the cross-curricular planning with all teachers. Traditionally, in high schools, English teachers do planning together in isolation. Math teachers do their own planning. But when you bring in your career technical educators and your fine arts teachers, your theater tech teachers, and you bring them together and you start opening up what is actually being taught, that's when teachers can actually bring in more opportunities into a classroom because they're engaging the students and the students are really seeing their education come to life. And I realize that people say that's very hard to do, and it comes with a lot of practice, and you do have to get buy-in. On another point, we often think about career-connected learning as connecting students to one type of focus in high school, but we need to expose them to Dr. Goins' point. We need to expose them to many types of careers so that they can start exploring now in high school what they want to do or what they want to study in post-secondary education. High school should be a place where they feel free to explore different types of careers and interests so that they can be more focused. And as Dr. Goins shared the data regarding students that are in career technical education, yes, their college completion rates are higher because this work is being done with career and technical education students, but it needs to be spread out to all students across a traditional high school.
Excellent. Thank you, Ms. Gonzalez. Now, I know our viewers have a lot of questions for our panelists, but before we get to the Q&A, I want to ask Dr. Goins one last question. If you could leave school leaders with only a couple of pieces of advice on bridging the gap between the classroom and the real world, what would those pointers be?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I would add, and I'll pick up a little bit what Felicia said, is it's about expanding the student's horizon, right? If we can get students excited and engaged, everything else starts to take care of itself, right? I really do believe that. One of my favorite examples, I had a teacher call me one day and said, hey, a student was working in your math program and now they're off trying to explore this career. What am I supposed to do? Because the teacher at the time perceived that to be a problem. Like, hey, we're supposed to be doing math, but they now want to explore a career. And I said, that's a good thing. Like today we won. With that student, we won. That student is so engaged from a math problem that they now want to pursue a career. That is a very, very good day. In an example, we did a very small study in one of our states we're working with. And remember, we're trying to reimagine academic learning in math through the lens of a career. So how do we rethink this very complicated topic, math, and do it differently? And one of the things we're doing, and one of the things we're starting, besides seeing performance and test scores, which I think, Don, we've all talked about this. This is the pain sometimes of being an educator. We got to improve the test scores because that's what makes the newspapers. But what we started to see in our data was about a 40% increase in students wanting to pursue STEM careers. And I had to stop for a minute. And I said, wait a minute, we're trying to improve algebra. An algebra classroom And now we're getting a bump of 40% of students wanting to pursue a STEM career. And right now in this country, I don't think there's a federal grant that's come out that doesn't ask for the focus on STEM, because there's such a need for STEM. And I'm like, I think everybody thinks it's like we have to do these big STEM activities in a school and we have to do all of this extra work. And I'm like, how about we just teach algebra through the lens of a career that utilizes these occupations in the real world? And what we started seeing was this big bump. And we saw an additional bump of about 60% of the students wanting to pursue career tech. Because a lot of students don't understand, how much do these jobs pay, and where can I go work, and what is the demand of these jobs? And so beyond just teaching algebra, it's how do we expand the horizon? I mean, Felicia talked about cross-curricular, Don talked about it, but how do we expand this horizon and create this equity of opportunity for students? And that's where I think we can really do a good job. And that's where I get excited about the journey we're on, is trying to help educators figure out ways to do that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Goins, Ms. Gonzalez, and Dr. Barton. You've given us excellent advice on how to achieve educational innovation through career-connected learning. So now let's take some questions from our viewers. I'm sure they have a lot that they want to ask you. And we'll start with this one. I really like the idea of integrating career-connected learning into the curriculum, but switching curricula is a huge lift. How do you recommend getting buy-in for this kind of change when there are so many stakeholders involved? Dr. Goins, do you want to start this one?
Yes, and this one could take the next 2 hours, but I'll take 2 minutes. No, this is hard. I mean, change is very, very hard, right? And especially when you think about it through the lens of a topic like math or career-connected learning, because you're really going into an environment and saying, we want to change what we've been doing for the past several years, and it is met hard. And I've always said that a lot of it is you've got to find the innovators first, who are the willing. How do we find those willing to make that change? Because a lot of educators are nervous. They've not done this before. They're measured by all of these other criteria that are pushing on them every day. And so I think part of it is find those innovators, those people that are excited to do things different, that are saying, hey, we are ready to change. And from that, get the results, and then let the results go back and impact the other people within that environment. And it is hard. It is complicated, because I think thinking about math different, I'm a former math teacher, and just thinking about doing that differently would probably scare a lot of people. But when you get on this journey and you start seeing what engagement looks like and that student autonomy, I always said I was an amazing teacher when my kids wanted to be in my classroom. I looked amazing every day. And the goal is, how do we make that learning so excited that the kids want to be there? And that's one example of how we do it.
I would love to add to what Dr. Goins says, is that the key also is to finding the ones that actually want to do this work, and making them or providing them the supports, and then turning them into those that are working with other teachers to bring them on board to do the professional development. Because when it's coming from their peers, it's a little different when it's coming from top down to the teachers, directly to the teachers, until there is that true buy-in. But as far as changing curriculum, that's something that needs to be done purposefully and slowly. Professional development doesn't often come alongside any time curriculum is changed in a building. And it takes time for educators to be able to deliver something new in the classroom successfully.
Excellent. Thank you. Dr. Goins, this next one is for you. Can you give us more specific examples of what that STEM curriculum in New Mexico looks like? What aspects of it made so many more students interested in a STEM path?
Sure. And again, we talked a little bit about this in the research, following the research, and even thinking about this. So one of the things we did in the development of our curriculum, we put 650 careers inside math, and a lot of those careers all are high wage, high growth. But the idea was, how do we create this exposure, and how do we create it to a variety of occupations? And as students are learning algebra and geometry, again, we're going back to the core question. We started with this. When am I ever going to use this? We're trying to answer that question for students every day. This is when you're going to use it. And oh, by the way, here's an occupation, and this occupation might be in the STEM field, right? And I think what students are seeing, they're going through and they're saying, hey, wait a minute, I did not know this career existed, but I'm doing the math and I'm seeing the career as I'm doing the math. And so it's a way to open that door. And it's a subtle way. I always say, how do we create these opportunities for students by connecting education, employment, and economic development with a lens on equity? And what we're trying to do is, by designing math this way, we're saying, here's an occupation. It's high wage, high growth. It's connected to your local community. It's in the STEM field. And now you're practicing that algebra through that real world connection. I think students just walk away going, hey, wait a minute, I just did that. I can now pursue that career. And that's really exciting to see. And that's where I get excited. One of the research things we did, we asked students across the board, we said, you saw a career today in a math classroom. And remember, this is math. And 91% of the students say they want to learn more about the career. And that is just a huge outcome. And again, we're teaching things like quadratic equation, right? What a function is. And so you would not normally think about that in that environment. The other outcome I love that we've seen is one of the teachers' comments that's one of my favorite. Teachers said, in my classroom, students take risk and they have conversations. And if you think about it, your average math classroom, that's probably not a statement you hear. I'm taking a risk in a math classroom and I'm having a conversation. But I think this idea of enlightening them about these career pathways and career connected learning opens it up. And that's what we've seen in New Mexico.
Excellent. Thank you. Ms. Gonzalez, this next one is for you. You had mentioned that getting teachers to collaborate across disciplines is a big undertaking. Did you have difficulty getting teacher buy-in on that approach? And if so, how did you convince them to get on board?
Well, a simple answer was yes, it was difficult and to get that buy-in, but surprisingly, it was a little bit more difficult to get that buy-in from the core content teachers. It was not difficult to get that buy-in from the career technical education teachers. As you know, traditionally they come out of business and industry into teaching. So they were excited to sit down with your traditional teachers to do the cross-curricular planning. So it started out small, but it starts with providing supports and actually teaching them how to do the cross-curricular planning. And it is a big undertaking, but eventually they begin to own it. And where I really started to get the buy-in was when this level of engagement of the students went up and the student achievement and the grades went up. Let me tell you, those math teachers were all on board. And actually it became their favorite part of planning was on the PLC days where they were sitting down with the career technical education teachers. Those were their favorite days. Because it also helped the core content teachers reevaluate how they were teaching. And when they were starting to see the successes in the classroom, they were more excited to do this type of planning and to work alongside their colleagues to improve student achievement.
Perfect. Thank you. Our next question asks, if we're not ready to adopt a whole new curriculum, but are interested in making learning more relevant to students, what are some steps we can take to start in that direction? Dr. Martin, I'd love to get your perspective on this one.
Absolutely. Make it more interesting. A lot of folks say make learning fun. And we want it to be fun, but we want it to be interesting. We want students to be engaged. And we know that our students aren't always engaged in the four core content areas. There's strengths and there's weaknesses. And so you don't need to take a leap and switch curriculums entirely, because obviously that creates a lot of issues internally. You can't do that financially. It's difficult to do one sweep of a curriculum change. It's a really buy-in with teachers, with educators, with the entire school community. But you can make those small changes to make learning interesting. I'll give you an example. I was a fifth grade teacher several years ago for a number of years, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I taught science and social studies. And one of the things we did were units, thematic units, if you remember those. And we did the solar system. And, I sat with a math teacher and the English teacher and said, how do we hit home with this? Our students love hearing about the solar system, but we begin to do creative writing with centered around the solar system. And then the math teacher would integrate in and talk about distance from the moon and the planets and the different times that the planets shift. And people became engaged because there was that cross-curricular approach. We didn't change one thing curriculum-wise. We didn't spend one extra dollar doing that. What we did is we changed our style to fit our students' needs. And I think that's so important. When you take a look at our clients in this business, it's the students. And so sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. You have to be able to read your audience when you're an educator. I think my colleagues would agree with that. And I think that's how you make those changes. That's how you make that more interesting to students. To answer that question, it's making it interesting, and it's really going that maybe that extra mile, maybe not an extra mile, but it's really just taking that feedback from students and really just taking that all in, and at the end of the day, they become engaged.
Well said. Thank you. Our next question says, you've rightly noted that a lot of educational initiatives come and go. Why should educators see career-connected learning as a priority and not another fad? I'm sure you all have something to add, but Dr. Goins, why don't you start us off here?
Sure, and I'll state this kind of simple. I think research that looks at student engagement that's been around for a long time kind of really bears this out. There was a study done by the National Dropout Prevention Network. And what they were trying to study was students that are at risk, that are on that verge, and how do we keep them connected to the environment? And what they found in the study, and I believe it was one of the largest studies that's been conducted of dropouts, what they found was the least effective strategy to keep a student engaged or tethered to that school environment, because that's our goal. Let's not cut the strings. Let's not lose these kids. How do we keep them tethered to the environment and where we can get the outcome? The least effective strategy was academic support. And I think what we keep trying to do is we keep trying to increase the level of academics without answering the fundamental question kids are asking. When am I going to use this? Make this relevant for me. And I think what career-connected learning starts with is the premise, let's start there. Let's make this relevant for, as Don said, who our clients are, the students. And how do we, when we make that relevant, then I think the performance and all those other measures improve it. And I think that's why it goes beyond a fad. I think the research really starts to bear it out. By the way, the most effective strategy in that same study was show a student they have a future via a career, and you have amazing outcomes. And so when I look at research like that, and I'm like, okay, we've got to stop trying to perfect the best math problem in a math textbook. What we've got to do is we've got to go back and say, let's connect with these students. Let's create opportunities. And then from that, we still have to do everything else. We still have to teach. We still have to write lesson plans. We still have to do best practices. All of that will follow. But I think that is where I think career-connected learning could be something beyond a fad.
And I would love to add that if there's anybody participating today that has not taken a look at their career and technical education data, I encourage you to do so. so that you can see that the data that Dr. Goins shared earlier is most likely true in your school or in your school district. Here in Nevada, we know that our career and technical education students that spend at a minimum 2 years in a career technical pathway actually have the higher level of graduation, outperforming all demographics across the board. So we know that career-connected learning is an initiative that has been around for a very long time that needs to continue to move forward.
And I'll just kind of wrap things up with that, because my colleagues couldn't have said it better. It's really about exposure, and it's so exposing. Excuse me, it's exposing students at a young age for this. It's really about finding that spark and finding passion. I believe we're all very passionate about our work. We tell people all the time, it's great to love your job. It's really sad when you hear people talking about how they hate their job and they're at a dead end. It's very sad. We tell our students continuously that we provide those opportunities to expose such a variety of careers to them. And let's face it, when we take a look at the scale of economy right now, that really plays into that. When you look at the opportunities for students in career education, those opportunities may not have existed 10, 20 years ago, at least in our region. So we did push the 4-year degree, and we did push those more professional studies. Now that really plays well with us in terms of exposing students and talking with them. It's about passion, but it's about going back to that lifelong learner and also that productive citizen. And so when you start to talk about, with early age high school students about the amounts of dollars they can make, that becomes attractive to them as well, along with that passion. So I think that we can't forget about that, and we have to be able to provide students with the best opportunities that they're going to be successful. And I think that goes along with exposing this at a very young age.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I think we've got time for one more question, and this looks like a good place to close up. You've all talked about the need to rethink some things in education, but do you think we need to rethink education altogether? We're trying small iterations of the same basic approach we've taken for decades, and academic results are getting worse. I'll probably have something to add here, but Dr. Martin, let's start with you.
Yeah, and I think we have to really take a look at when we say academic results are getting worse, because I would respectfully disagree in many areas with that. And let me explain. I think when we go back to assessments and test scores, I think there's data that can show that. I think when we take a look at students individually and when we do our portfolios with students, I don't think educators would agree with that, because now more than ever, we're seeing excitement. We're seeing a lot of students getting charged about the different opportunities that they can have. And really, it's about, I mentioned exposure before. I mentioned the excitement that students have, the engagement level. And so do I think we need to scrap what we've done for years in education and start over? Absolutely not. I mean, we have really built upon a strong foundation. I think what we need to realize is that we also have a lot of issues that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. Mental health is at an all-time high crisis. Again, when we take a look at students with special needs, we see that. We have a population here at IU1 that it obviously becomes challenging in terms of educating students with disabilities if you don't have the right tools. And I think it really goes back to having those right resources, those appropriate resources. It really goes back to that exposure. And again, in some areas, have we not hit the mark? Absolutely. But as long as you learn from that and you build upon it, and I think this is an exciting time in education right now moving forward, particularly with the the resources that we have, and particularly with the careers that are available for students.
And I'd love to add on to that, kind of bring it back to what we spoke about earlier, is the need to clearly articulate the vision and the path forward, number one. And number two is finding the time for educators to plan and to truly engage students in what they're learning.
Dr. Goins, any final thoughts there?
No, and I want to say a huge thank you to the opportunity to work with both Don and Felicia in this real world to where we're trying to solve these complicated problems. Only thing I would say to that, and I think I would echo everybody's sentiments from today. I mean, I think we research, if we take the time to read the research, dive into what research says, figure out ways to implement some of those strategies, I think you start to see those outcomes. And I think what Felicia said to wrap up, as far as in developing the vision and the strategy and the opportunity for teachers to do this, I think is where you'll see the biggest outcome. And so I get excited by where we are in education. I do believe education needs to change. The world's changing super fast, and we have to help equip these students for their future. Again, going back to my quote from John Dewey, how do we help students find what they're fitted to do, but then secure that opportunity to do that? And I remind educators, he said that in the early 1900s. And that quote is as true today in year 2024 as it was in 1900 when John Dewey crafted that. And I think it's the lens we think about, and that's where I get excited about where I think the future of education can go, especially with leaders like Don and Felicia.
Very well said. And I think that that's a great note to end on. So thank you again to our panelists, Dr. Joseph Goins, Felicia Gonzalez, and Dr. Donald Martin. If you asked a question during the Q&A that we did not get to, the Pathway to Careers team will follow up by email to give you an answer. I just want to take a minute before we close to sum up some key takeaways from this conversation. First, what we're doing isn't working. Schools are investing huge amounts of time, energy, and money into raising academic achievement, but scores keep dropping. It's time to take a step back and rethink certain elements of the traditional approach to education. 2, allow creativity and innovation. One size fits all doesn't work. Don't stifle the creativity of teachers and local and school leaders. 3, make learning relevant. The best way to engage students is to show them the connections between what they're learning in different classes and how it all connects to the real world. And finally, help your students build social capital. You can't control the networks your students have been born into, but you can control how much you expose them to the larger world, to opportunities available to them, and to ways they can pursue those opportunities. Thank you, everyone. If this webinar has you thinking about incorporating career-connected learning, visit p2c.org for more information. Today's webinar will be available on demand if you want to review anything that we've talked about today. Thank you for watching.